Hello, good evening and welcome to our monthly installment of Moesif's Meetups. We're coming to you live from the heart of Silicon Valley here in San Francisco, California. I'm Lawrence Ebringer, the Chief Marketing Officer of Moesif, the API observability platform. We provide insights and tooling for API product owners to activate, understand, and monetize their customers. Joining me tonight is friend of Moesif, Jeremy Glassenberg, a product manager of APIs at DocuSign. Welcome, Jeremy. Where in the world did you walk from?
So I actually just walked right over here from the DocuSign office, just a little bit east of us here in San Francisco.
Okay, and how many arrests did you see on the way?
I think just one, about a block away from here.
Okay, nice.
DocuSign was in a safer area, so
yeah,
you have to hang out at the 6th and Mission area.
It's colorful at 6th and Mission, very colorful. So Jeremy is a 14-year veteran of APIs. As employee 20-ish at Box, he was one of their first product managers, started the DevRel team, and grew their dev community to more than 15,000. Since then, he's held product leadership roles at Edmodo, Pinn, Tradeshift, and now DocuSign. Jeremy also advises and mentors startups, which he is doing currently with Moesif. So we're here today to talk about how to efficiently scale your APIs across your large enterprise. But before we get into that, let's share with our audience a little bit about how big the API program is at DocuSign. Just to put it in context, the DocuSign website says there are 500 million API transactions conducted over their API. They have almost 500,000 companies using the APIs with 100,000 developers. Those are big numbers. Tell us about what you can about the API program and what it's used for, and internal versus external, perhaps.
Yeah, and what I can share, when I finally joined DocuSign full-time, I got to see certain numbers that I'm not sure which ones I'm allowed to share, but basically they were pleasantly surprising as to what percentage of the agreements that are actually sent via DocuSign are happening through our APIs. And long story short, DocuSign does really like APIs. And I've only been working at DocuSign for about a year and a half. Back when I was at Box, which goes back 14 years ago, we were close partners with DocuSign. And so I've known them since their early days, and they've had APIs for a long time. So they had APIs before they were cool, Not that we're hipsters at DocuSign, but yeah, like they had APIs back in the days of XML and even earlier in the days of SOAP when API design really sucked. And they've updated, of course, with the rise of OpenAPI and JSON and better standards. Like any company working on APIs, they have their challenges, but of course they also have been dealing with challenges of having APIs from before there were standards, when APIs generally were a pain. And of course, have been just ongoing improving them as they've continued to be key to the company's revenue and growth.
Right. Would you say, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but would you say it's a growing portion of the DocuSign business, or is it flat, or?
I can't acknowledge too many specifics, but I made some jokes about this recently with the trends that we've seen in COVID, where DocuSign was one of those many companies that went from being a multi-billion-dollar company in the unicorn space to being a $10+ billion company and $40 billion plus company going into the decacorn space. And of course, if you look at the stocks among many of the companies in Silicon Valley, that shifted in the last 9 months. But APIs are actually continuing to grow, so it's a good time to still be in the space of APIs. Demand for APIs has not declined from that.
Great. Yeah, we're all very happy that APIs are still growing, even if the public markets have not been as frothy as they were in the last couple of years. So as a 14-year veteran in APIs, you'll remember back when in the halcyon days of XML, like the earliest outset of APIs, devs had a much easier time of it. There weren't any standards. They could design their API. They could get going fairly fast. Do you think that was a better era for developers back then? Or do you think with standardization and especially open API, we're in a better place today?
Oh yeah, back in my day, it's much simpler time. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have cars and big businesses, and
no wheels.
All we had to worry about was polio and
right.
Yeah, things were way nicer back then. No, I think I actually was helping to set up a support group for an emotional support group for anyone who had to work on SOAP APIs. Just kidding. I remember those days, and DocuSign, as an outsider, I could see that DocuSign had challenges. When I was at Box, we had challenges there where 14 years back, we were just thinking like, APIs aren't rocket science. There are certain little things that you need to know to like make them successful, but it's oddly difficult to use. And even back then, I'd seen connector tools, kind of like Zapier now. There were connector tools back in the day, but they weren't really panning out. Like they were so difficult to use, it was just easier to just write code into every API, and that was because APIs are just so inconsistent. Okay, you could whip up and knock out an API without any rules around it, but then you had to actually maintain that thing yourself. And then your developers who are actually going to work with your APIs along with other APIs, well, that took way more code because none of these things looked alike. So yeah, no, it goes back to, was it simpler back in the day when, hospitals just relied on leeches? Like they in one way it was simpler, but the experience wasn't as good.
Right, and we were all drinking moonshine. Right. So the takeaway is that it's better with standardization because of interoperability. Even though the dev's job might be harder, you can get different pieces of code to talk to each other much easier today. So we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I think all this time there were attempts to get standards adopted. Okay, back in the days of SOAP, there actually was, the WSDL, so you had to have a standard, and that actually was a big pro to SOAP. It was just otherwise SOAP was very heavy and painful. So when we're looking at the world of Open API. If we look at like Google Drive, Dropbox, and Box, they're all competitors in the same space, and they all have REST-ish, or at least REST-like APIs today, utilizing the Open API standard. Even if they're doing so, it's pretty easy to make API calls that work across these products, but there are visibly differences. The APIs still aren't consistent. They're closer than they were back in the days of just Wild West XML, but there are still differences, and that's generally expected across different companies. There are efforts to say, if you're in the same industry, try to make your APIs consistent. But a challenge, kind of the focus today is, well, okay, if you use Open API, it helps you to design your APIs well and design things according to REST principles. It makes things more aligned, so they generally work better with connector tools. They generally work more easily with other APIs. But as the company grows, you're going to have many teams working on different APIs. This has been a challenge for DocuSign as well as many companies that during the last few years have gone from being a unicorn to decacorn, and from one team making all the APIs to a wider range of different product teams building different products in different APIs. And so how do you then make sure that your APIs aren't just well designed according to REST, but really are designed very closely together? Google had this challenge in many ways. Like years ago, Box was a launch partner for the Google Apps Marketplace. It's now the Google Workspace Marketplace. This is Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides, Google Drive. And when we were working with these, we had a basic integration where content from Box could be edited in Google Docs or Google Sheets or Google Slides. And all three of those products had little differences in their APIs. So if you knew how to upload a spreadsheet into Google Sheets, it was actually different to getting the content into Google Docs. Now this is because Google Sheets came from a startup called iRose. Google Docs was Writely. I forgot what Google Slides was, but it was 3 different companies acquired by Google, which initially had different APIs. Now within what's now the Google Workspace team, they established consistency, obvious consistency across those products. But Google as a whole had many other teams working on other APIs, and I wasn't working at Google at the time. So this is an outsider. But you can find information on this. I met some people over at the Google I/O conference, and I saw that there was an initiative to get consistency across their APIs, and this was like I think around 12 years ago. So this predates OpenAPI. I think predates Swagger. This is a time when JSON was happening more and more, and I think the Google APIs are generally on JSON already, but they basically had to establish their own means of standardization for their APIs. Like we can get more into how you apply API governance at your company, but in general, it's still around the OpenAPI schema, an additional schema on top of that. That didn't exist, and so I actually ran into this issue when working with Google. I was trying to have like certain Google APIs interact with other APIs by utilizing an OpenAPI schema, and it turned out they didn't have OpenAPI schemas at the time because they basically created their own schema.
Right.
And you can find information on the old schema, but yeah, they had to basically create their own means of defining APIs there because it didn't exist at the time.
Right.
So yeah, API governance and consistency was also really, really a pain before we started to get more standard schemas going.
Right, right. So backtracking a little bit, when you do scale your APIs across a larger enterprise, you've maybe had some acquisitions, you have different products, you're offering different APIs. I mean, I'm mirroring what's going on at DocuSign. What in your perspective are the best-in-class tools that can help with the governance and management and the control of that burgeoning APIs? And I'm thinking about linters and auto-generators of API specs and docs, and maybe observability tools, perhaps like Moesif. Shameless plug. So can you cycle through what you think would be the better best-in-class tools that an enterprise should be employing?
When I do give talks about API governance in general, Moesif does naturally come into it. Because yeah, API analytics and monitoring is a factor.
Right.
I usually say first and foremost, before you get into API governance, we need to make sure that you're taking the preceding steps, like applying what we're generally calling like design first principles for your APIs. What I also call applying product process to your APIs. Designing your APIs based on actual use cases. With all the tooling that's out there today, it's very easy to say auto-generate an API right off your database. It's easy to do, but if you're opening up your API to the external community in practice, it doesn't really work very well. What really matters is understanding how is your API going to be used? Is it an enterprise company where your customers are going to need your APIs to make custom integrations just themselves? Do you intend to have a marketplace with partners, creating integrations for your customers? Really, what kind of apps are you going to get built? And then how do you design your APIs to make it as easy as possible? Now, when you're applying that along with RESTful principles, that's going to allow you to design APIs according to use case and then APIs according to scale. That'll also help your APIs kind of look similar to other APIs in the industry, to make them work well together. And if you're applying those principles, there are a lot of tools around the OpenAPI schema that allow that. Designer tools like API editors like Stoplight, Swagger Hub, Insomnia by Kong. And then tools to auto-generate your documentation, tools to help you whip up a developer portal, tools to generate code samples and API libraries. And so you can design your APIs and then automate the process of building and launching and managing your APIs using all these tools around OpenAPI. But then you run into this challenge that DocuSign and others have had recently, which is, okay, you have well-designed APIs, and now you have many different teams working on APIs. Now these teams may use different tools, they may have different priorities, they may have different quality of APIs, and even if, in theory, you have all these teams independently really prioritizing APIs, applying design-first principles, and providing high-quality APIs, they're going to get disjoint. And a common challenge you'll see then is if you want partners to build products, build integrations with different products of yours, if the output of one API for one product doesn't really work as the input for another API without extra code to transform the data, this just makes it more difficult in your community. If you're trying to bring your products together and help your partners to build integrations that show that your products work together, you need more than just well-designed RESTful APIs. And so API governance is really about saying that we're going beyond the open API requirements and making sure, meaning the requirements of an open API schema, and saying we're going to set additional requirements to make sure that our APIs are consistent, that we're using strong typing, that we're using the same properties as much as possible, same parameters, casing. Ideally, we're using the same underlying models for all of our APIs. And just as there were tools to make it easier to just design APIs, tools have been coming along, I'd say in the last 2-3 years, to make API governance easier. So this I find important because in practice, if you really want teams to adopt API standards, you can't just define a standard and throw it at them. In general, the way every successful company that has established standards, they do it in an egalitarian approach. First, they have an understanding that you can no longer have one team define the APIs for all your teams. I've been in these places where APIs start disjoint and you centralize it. It's like a small company, there's no real thought around APIs, so you centralize it in one API team. Then at a certain stage, you can't have it all under one API team, and instead, you have to just have a facilitating team where each team has the autonomy to define the APIs for their product, but there's one team that's providing guidance and making sure these APIs are consistent. And that's a team that's responsible for setting the standard. But that team can't just go and define a standard and say everyone use it. Rule number one is have something like an API council, where no taxation without representation is what I've used in some talks.
Yeah, I don't know, as a British person, I don't really know whether I like that term or not, but I know it has historical significance in this country, so I'll let you use it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the Brits want to keep up on APIs,
yeah, tell me about it.
Move away from the royal family.
Don't bring them into it.
Actually, William Pinn implemented it better than us.
Yeah, okay, all right.
But yeah, the deal is for an API council, I find that any team that is going to be working on API has to have a say in what the standards are going to be. You can only enforce it if any team feels that they can critique the standard. So that's one aspect. You have to make sure this is egalitarian, but then the other is,
So let me just interject there for a moment. So at the bigger companies you worked at, you do have that setup where you have a council, people have their own say, and things get done by committee.
Yes. Now, by committee and how we define how that committee works, that's another story. Like at bigger and bigger companies, you can't do consensus.
Right.
I mean, smaller companies don't necessarily want consensus.
No.
And in practice, what you just have to do is just like let people have their say. It's just sometimes, and you always have to listen. It's just sometimes you're going to say no to them. At smaller companies, I'd say when you're at the $30 billion mark, you're less than 10,000 employees. It's a dozen or so teams or less working on APIs. You can really make sure that each team has a say in every meeting. As the companies get larger and larger, you have to have a relatively smaller number of representation, but every team has to feel in one way or another some representation there.
Yeah, to be bought in to some degree.
Yeah. So there's that, there's a human approach, making sure that there's that egalitarian aspect. But the other is, even if you've established the standards and everyone wants to go by the standards, some teams may be more interested in adopting the standard than others. B, some teams may be just as interested, but they may have less experience with APIs, and it may just be more difficult for them to take the time to look at the standards. So there are easy solutions to this. If you want higher quality, consistent APIs, make it easier for your teams to build APIs. And that's really where the tooling comes into play. So some tools I've talked about are, say, the Linter,
Right.
which is, there's already the open API schema that, helps you to auto-generate documentation if you design your API according to the schema, and inherently it guides you to, a nice RESTful API if you go by the open API requirements. A Linter can just allow you to, on top of open API, enforce any additional standards that have been determined by your API council. Like a Linter can say, hey, you have to apply camel case to your path parameters, your endpoints. You have to have a snake case for your query parameters. You may say that all query parameters have to be optional. We're not going to allow query parameters to be required, and have basically additional restrictions that can be automatically detected. The nice thing about Linters too is, okay, one, you can put them in your CI/CD pipeline, so when any team is working on updates to the API, this thing can just right off the bat warn you that something's wrong before your API update goes live. I've seen in practice, it's not that teams, sometimes a centralized team has friction with another team that keeps releasing APIs not according to the standard. And it's usually not malicious, it's just it's really hard for them to check and catch their issues. Maybe that team has grown, it's hard for them to manage it. You give them the right tools, they're happy to go with the system because it's going to help them to catch issues in their API and incidentally help them to get their APIs aligned with everyone else. The other thing I love is, in these API editors, you can have shared API models. A bigger thing, in my opinion, than having consistency in the formatting of your endpoints is, in practice, the majority of API endpoints are really based off of API models. And the easiest way to make sure that, APIs from different products can work together is if they're, as much as possible, using the same underlying models. Because then when you're auto-generating API libraries, a developer can grab the output of an API from one product and use it as the input in another product if they're all endpoints around the same models. So if you establish within your council what are certain models that you just want to be commonly reused, you can share that in an API editor. And as teams plan their APIs and design their APIs, it'll auto-suggest your API models. I whipped up a tool that auto-generates endpoints right off of a model. I think Axway has a feature like that. So you could actually do is, as people are planning their APIs, you can suggest them models to use. They grab those, half of their APIs are just auto-generated for them, at least by design, and naturally are just going to work very well with the other APIs you already have. So you're making it easier for teams to design their APIs in general, and inherently these APIs are also going to be more aligned to your standard.
How accurate, how bulletproof are these linters? It seems like you're relying on them an awful lot to correct and bring in rules and regulations and specifications that I would worry that you're relying on this tool and then you deploy it and you found there were shortcomings in the linter.
Yeah, they're as good as how well they work depends on how well you work with them. But there is a bit of a challenge today with the quality of linters that I've seen. If we go back a few years, before OpenAPI, there was Swagger. There was also RAML. I think MuleSoft was using that. And then there was API Blueprint that other companies were using. And so I had that challenge where there were certain tools I wanted to use, like auto-generate code samples and auto-generate documentation. And there was a better system to generate code samples from Swagger, and then a preferred tool for the documentation generator that worked off of API Blueprint. Mm-hmm. So we actually had some disjoint standards back in the day when it came to just defining the API. Things really consolidated finally all into OpenAPI, and that's how now everything is built just on OpenAPI. In the world of linters, we don't yet have a very clear standard for it. So, I've seen the linter that is in SmartBear Swagger Hub. There's the Spectral linter that's by Stoplight. There are others floating around. My personal preference is Stoplight, but everyone has to go and research for themselves because there isn't definitively a standard yet. So yeah, that does mean, at any company, you really only need one linter choice. So it's not like it's not like OpenAPI where you may wind up with different companies using different things. The linter usually is internal, so that makes this less of a challenge. At the same time, I think these linters are still very much a work in progress. I've seen that certain linters have advantages over others, so they're just a few years behind the OpenAPI schema. But in time, I think that's going to improve, and it's best if that does consolidate because, ideally you're going to see some tools around these linters as well. So another challenge you'll find is, the linters are just defined in JSON. Okay, it's just like OpenAPI. Some teams are better at defining their standards in a linter than others. And then whenever I see anything in JSON or YAML, like a manifest, I always ask, can you just put an interface on top of it so you can just have a designer? Okay, Stoplight is actually starting to do that. I'm not sure when they launched it, but it is actually possible to just have through Stoplight, just have an interface to actually design your linter and just set your rules without having to code it in JSON. So I'm seeing the trend that I've seen happen with OpenAPI, but unfortunately it is a little bit behind, so the linters are going to be a little janky for now.
Right, janky, I like that. Yeah, jankiness and production worthy don't really go hand in hand, but yeah, it's a work in progress. So if we assume that companies have prioritized API governance, where do you see the failure points coming from for APIs that are deployed across a larger enterprise?
So much of it can be the human error, where you establish your standards, but how do you enforce it? And sometimes it's that you're going to every team and saying, okay, here are our standards, and teams are like, we don't want to. Usually it's teams are like, well, we want to, but we don't have enough information. We're still just learning OpenAPI, like what do we do? That's why it's helpful to have these sort of tools, and I've done this a few times. You take something like Linter, put in the CI/CD process, then it's like, okay, this thing's just gonna let you know if you're doing something wrong. Makes it easier. We're going to give you some things to make it easier. That's why I emphasize that the tools around governance are so important to make this more streamlined. Otherwise, it's really a struggle. You're herding cats working team by team, and then as you grow, new teams will come along working on APIs, and they're not going to go to, and you have to train them up, and then they hire new people, and you have to go back and train them up because they're not going to train them up.
Right.
So it's a big challenge for just management, and that's what I've seen actually at bigger companies. I'm not going to name names, but some companies established some policies around API governance, and they were able to enforce it for a little while, and then the system collapsed. Now, so far, what I've seen with tooling is it is more likely to be successful at the outset, and I trust it's also more likely to scale. So there's the human error of trying to dictate the standards and not understanding you need to let everyone have their say in the standards.
Right. The no taxation without representation.
Yeah. And then that principle of just make it easier for people to design their APIs, and if you throw in the tools that way, they'll make it designed according to your standards. So that's number two. Even when you get the teams to agree to these, and it can be a challenge getting things into the pipelines, getting the linter to work there, and other tools to really help to check that the APIs are working, or that the APIs are designed accordingly. There are other just little challenges here, and that does go back to there's this dream of automating everything, but we are relying on many open source tools. Some tools are fairly new. Things are going to be janky. Auto-generating code libraries. It's very common now. A few years ago, there was always this debate of do we want to use these auto-generators or do we want to just create our code libraries and SDKs by hand? Because if you created your libraries manually, they were really always of higher quality.
Right.
And the old code libraries, people could tell they were auto-generated. They didn't really like them. But then you had these other challenges of, if you're creating them manually, then what do you do when you're updating your API? okay, so then we have to say these manually created libraries, those are not officially supported. They're higher quality, but we're not updating them every time we're releasing an API because we don't want to have to wait to release the API for updates to all of our corresponding API libraries or SDKs. So there was this kind of ongoing challenge of like quality versus like being up to date.
Yeah.
And I remember some teams also had to like sacrifice auto-suggest functionality because in their SDKs because they basically said, well, if we add new properties to our APIs, the SDKs, if we don't update the SDKs, or if we update the SDKs but the developer doesn't download the latest SDK, they're not going to have access to the properties of our APIs unless we do just JSON blobs instead of statically coded properties reflected in the SDKs. But if you do those dynamic blobs, you lose auto-suggest. So there are all these like little caveats, and over time, basically the companies that have higher quality APIs and SDKs, I watched them transition to auto-generated libraries. Because the quality was good enough, and there's this benefit of we have everything else set up so that we're constantly adding APIs and updating our APIs, and it's better if the SDKs are up to date than if they're these, handmade, super use case driven SDKs. And sometimes they also balance it out where it's like half automated, half, helper functions that are handmade. But then we're now consequently more consistently using auto generators for our code samples in our libraries. And they've gotten better, but they can still be challenging. I found that many teams, they're creating APIs, defining them properly in the open API scheme, they're meeting our standards, and then the SDK generator is breaking. Because the SDK generator doesn't recognize certain properties that are valid in Open API, and we forgot to warn developers about that. In practice, what I've seen is just be aware.
That never happens at Moesif, by the way, does it? Never, no.
Now, in practice, I found that you just have to be aware that's going to happen and look at all the tools that come out at the end and be like, okay, we have our standards requirements, we have the Open API, and then we also happen to know from experience that our doc generator doesn't recognize these things. You better make sure that people understand that and just catch that earlier.
Right.
And then there may be a few things where you just don't realize it's going to happen. Maybe you switch to a new doc generator and it worked for your primary APIs, and then a smaller API team did something you didn't expect, which should have been totally valid. The doc generator didn't work. So you just have to be ready for, as you grow, some tools just not working properly. You'll catch the error. You have to work with that team. Just make sure everyone's just ready for things to go wrong as these tools still, remain janky.
Right, janky again. Yeah. So it sounds like you have to keep your developer community definitely updated about jankiness or new features or modifications to your functions or databases. Otherwise, there's going to be problems. So communication is very important too.
Yeah, it's it really is about setting the standards, having the right tools, and yes, communication.
Right.
And that is also just a human factor. Tools will not solve everything, but they will solve a lot of things here.
Right, got it. A little bit like best practices when you deprecate an API. There's 900 steps you should go through to make sure that you don't leave anyone in the lurch.
Yeah, and I've had clients, I've had employers where this kind of comes up for the central team. They've had a lot of frustration with other teams. They try to get the standards established, and I bring in the tools, and I should, other teams are ready to adopt the tools. It's not they didn't want to work with us, it's just that, they needed help. But then I'd always hear, not always, but I'd sometimes hear from certain team members on that central API definitions team, oh, but tools aren't going to solve it. We know we're going to run into these issues. And I say, yes, tools aren't going to solve it on their own. You need some other things, but here's the plan. It's 3 things. If you take tools out of the equation, it's not going to work. If you only use tools, it's not going to work. We'll use tools along with communication, establishing proper standards, and 3-legged stool, that'll actually hold.
Right. A little bit like the 80-20 rule. It sounds like the tools get you 80% of the way there, but you still have to fill in the gaps around that. So tell me what you mean by, or what is meant by API unification, and how does that relate to governance?
Yeah, so I've heard the terms, there's API governance, API consistency, API unification. And sometimes I've seen all this used interchangeably. API governance we've basically gone to is it's the process of setting a standard where you say in addition to going with OpenAPI, going with REST, we have within our company additional requirements that our APIs are consistent. Some say that API unification is just that, but I find in practice it's really 3 levels. There's one, just having well-designed APIs. Then you get to many teams working on APIs within your company, so you have to get to API consistency.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's interest in saying, why do we have a bunch of disjoint products with their own APIs when it may make sense to have some APIs that work across these products? A unified API. Facebook had the Graph API. Microsoft's APIs today are primarily Graph APIs. That just where you can actually call one endpoint that works across multiple Microsoft products. So that's really what I define as API unification, where you actually start to have APIs that work across these products. And that...
Is that nirvana? Is that where all big enterprises are heading?
I think over time, if they execute very well, you wind up going to, at some point, a unified API, which in a way also re-centralizes the API strategy, because usually a unified API is actually handled by like one team saying, here's how the API is going to work. I do emphasize focus on API consistency before API unification. Among the reasons for that, so often when companies are thinking about having APIs work across products, the products need to have proper stories of why even your customers will want to actually use them together. So if you have disjoint APIs, it's probably reflective also of disjoint products, and your customers won't have a reason to use these products together, and partners won't have a reason to create integrations that work across products. So you won't even be able to really see the user stories to validate the need for some sort of unified API. But also, if you have API consistency, and this is speculative, but I anticipate with what will likely be a rise in GraphQL. Many of the popular unified APIs today I see are Graph APIs. They're not GraphQL, they're like REST Graph. GraphQL I see is working better, especially in this scenario. And this isn't me to talk about GraphQL and where things are going to go. My rough bet is that GraphQL will not completely replace REST, but it will continue to grow. It will be a big player in the world of APIs. And it does naturally fit very well when working across products. And if you have APIs that are designed with consistency, a GraphQL-based unified API is very, very easy to do, because GraphQL has been built right off the bat with a lot of tools around it, a schema around all the things that we wanted in the RESTful APIs that took years to get to. GraphQL had a head start. And so there are a lot of tools to actually auto-generate GraphQL APIs right off of REST. What I've seen in practice is if your APIs are consistent, it's very easy to actually create a GraphQL API that works across products. It's just a matter of, is the use case there? And if you've gotten teams to design APIs consistently, you'll have the opportunity to test this with your developer community. Let them work with APIs. Try to start taking the output of one API, working with another API. And when you start to see that, you'll see validated use cases for integrations across your products. Start putting out some beta GraphQL APIs and see what happens. And oh, you have a nice Graph API that's not REST Graph, it's a more natural Graph API built right off really solidly designed REST APIs. So the business, in addition to the tech process, actually flows quite naturally if you start with design first principles, standards for API consistency, and then if it makes sense, go the GraphQL route on top of your APIs.
Great summary. So there's buy-in there as well. Make sure the teams are bought in, and make sure you communicate as much as possible changes and modifications to not only your internal teams, but the developers using your products out there. So as a sort of a wind up here, and then we'll open up for questions. You're an old hand of APIs. You're an old hand at APIs, I should say. Not you're an old API, but you could be an old API. What have you seen in your 14 years as the biggest changes, and where are we heading?
Yeah, so first of all, there are people who've worked on APIs far longer than me, but I am old now, so you can make fun of me. And I guess I can say there wasn't APIs before they were cool. Not hipster though, definitely not hipster. But I have seen trends, and trend number one is just standardization and the tools around it. When working on all these APIs back in the days of XML, I was thinking it should be pretty easy to auto-create many of the APIs. It should be pretty easy to auto-create the APIs in such a way that connector tools are more feasible. Connector tools 14 years ago existed and they sucked. And it wasn't their fault. It was the industry's fault. Zapier couldn't do what it did with the APIs 14 years ago. Now, with some of these connector tools, you upload your open API schema, that's how low-code, no-code is happening. And all these things, they were conceptualized long ago, but it could only happen if you got people to make their APIs in a consistent manner with a standard that everyone agreed to, do two tools around those standards to make it all easier. So yeah, trend number one is just everyone getting to REST, everyone getting out to standards, people utilizing tools. I remember back 10 plus years ago, API gateways were around too, and they weren't just expensive, they were heavy. And so often we have to really assess, is it worth it to use an API gateway, or should we just build the underlying infrastructure to the APIs ourselves? Now it's no longer a question. APIs are more straightforward. If they work with OpenAPI, it immediately saves at least weeks of engineering time to get an API launched. And that's where you have an API gateway with API monitoring built into the API gateway and API analytics built in an API gateway. And yeah, that's where it's
complemented by Moesif. Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. I'm surprised it didn't come up yet. But when you have the standards and you also have like every team using the same API gateway and underlying infrastructure, I've seen this issue too. If you have a bunch of disjoint APIs, API analytics is a pain. Your data team, your analytics team, they have to build custom code for every one of these and usually get better results from certain APIs than others. Over time, they kind of forget about some APIs, so the quality is lower, the workload is higher. Whereas if everything's on the same API gateway, you start to just plug in tools like Moesif, that's it. It's a solved problem.
Right, solved. Problem solved, Moesif. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is where over the last 5 years, I've been preaching a lot of please use these tools. It makes everything higher quality and makes everything a lot easier. I'd say the other trend will be things like GraphQL, where we continue to think outside the box and say, A, can we automate the whole process of designing these, and B, can we make APIs easier and easier to consume? So there's GraphQL, low-code, no-code. When it comes to GraphQL, what I actually anticipate happening is if it gets easier and easier to design, build, launch these APIs and manage these APIs, we're even starting to see this in the schemas, like schemas that kind of work with, that kind of represent both REST and GraphQL. You define your API once, you're just going to get REST and GraphQL APIs auto-generate easily. Okay, that's going to make it much, much, much easier to consume these APIs. Low-code, no-code is the other trend, which was a combination of APIs were inconsistent and we weren't really thinking what would the user experience be if I just wanted to connect things and not have to code them. So that goes back to applying product process when it comes to API products, developer experiences, and integrations in general. The tools make it easier, but you have to have that mindset of who are you building this for? How do you make it easier for them? That's really where low-code, no-code, the term is recent. The idea has been there for a long time. We're just seeing it actually achieve results now.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Well, that was a very interesting discussion about scaling APIs across your enterprise. And now we can open it up to those at home and those in the audience for questions. Yes, in the front here. Those at home is what is a really good example of an API?
Yeah, so in general, when it comes to just a well-designed API, I always say just when in doubt, what would Stripe do, what would Twilio do? That's outside of the discussion of API consistency and API standards. And I have to give a disclaimer, consider what would Twilio or Stripe do when they're at your stage. Because if you look at Stripe and Twilio today, they're later stage APIs and they're doing things that you will not want to do when you're starting off. The analogy I give is if you start weightlifting and you see someone who weighs 230 pounds of raw muscle, the logical thing would be copy what they're doing. It's a logical thing to do. It's also a really, really bad idea. You're going to get injured. Because at 230 pounds, they have to do different things to continue to gain muscle. Maybe they're not even focused on continuing to gain muscle. They're focusing on something else. What's important is what were they doing when they were at your stage in weightlifting. So examples I see there are companies that get excited about launching a developer forum. Well, if you launch a developer forum too early, you're going to launch with an empty forum. And then developers will come and see that empty forum and say, oh, wow, this is not an active developer platform, and walk away. I usually start with a developer blog. I post every 2 to 3 weeks. We don't need comments. The goal isn't even readership. The goal is just to have something that shows this is an actively managed developer site. And then as you get more and more inquiries and you see that you're hit this kind of saturation where you're getting the same question over and over again, you can go and launch a forum. And you'll be, you or your developer advocates will be the ones responding initially to everything in the forum, but as that builds out more and more, you may even have a community of people responding. But it's a multi-phased approach. And if you just copy what the big companies are doing now, it's not actually going to work. Now that's also, I have to warn, that's a general answer to well-designed APIs. When it comes to APIs with, consistency and standards, okay, I have to give a disclaimer here. I don't know exactly how Twilio did it and how Stripe did it. I think for Stripe, there's a lot I know about Stripe. A lot from their early days, from knowing some people in their early days. I know they have a centralized dev center team. I'm not sure what they've done as they've grown to ensure some sort of API consistency across teams. There's some things I've seen as an outsider, like if you look at Stripe.js, I think it started as checkout.js, was this copy and paste checkout module. And Stripe now has many other kind of embeddable modules. They're all in one script. I think what they did is they did establish a standard for embeddable client-side scripts, where you copy and paste one script, you tweak the code, you say, this is the component I want to load. That's kind of nice. They made sure that every team that's working on some sort of a UI component, an embeddable component, there's consistency there. So I can tell that Stripe was doing something there. But admittedly, I haven't analyzed exactly what they've done for consistency. I did appreciate what Microsoft did when I looked at their Graph API, made it all the way to API unification with the disclaimer that it's a Graph REST API, and in my opinion, and it's a speculative opinion, we'll see more GraphQL. Google, I appreciated what they did. At the same time, they did it before there was open API, and so they did certain things that you shouldn't do because there are better tools available now. So I'll actually concede that I don't have a great answer for the best benchmark of a big company that established API governance with modern tooling. And really it's partly because these tools I'm highlighting, they're a little janky now, just like OpenAPI when I started preaching it a few years ago. And I'm not the biggest driver of OpenAPI, I have to credit others for that, but I observed how I was really excited about it a few years ago and it got better and better. That's going to happen. Maybe some of you have a better example that I actually just don't know about, but otherwise, just ask me again in 2 years.
That's a very good note to finish on. This is the second time that Jeremy has honored us with his presence online. The first time was our very first APIs over IPAs podcast recording, which you can find on our YouTube channel. And I think this is a worthy follow-up. So I'd like to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for sharing what you're doing at DocuSign and how you can make APIs consistent and scalable across your large enterprise. Thank you very much.